Okay, so this will be the final Shiur on Sefer Yonah for this season. So let's review what we know so far, and we will try to put it all together. We have shown that the Book of Yonah should be read together with the narrative in Kisisa of after the Ego, when Moshe is negotiating with Hashem, where Hashem says to Moshe, "Shiches amcha asher haleso me'etzotayim," and Moshe says back to Hashem, "Lama Hashem yechav apcha be'amecha." So there's this debate: are they the nation of Moshe or are they the nation of Hashem? And there the pasuk is Vayinochem Hashem ala ro'ah asher diber la'asos le'amoy. And that pasuk, we'll start with that pasuk. That pasuk we showed is undermined by the pasuk at the end of Perek Gimel in Yonah, which says Vayinochem Elokim ala ro'ah asher diber la'asos lohem, to these people of Nineveh who are not Amoy. So that's a contradiction, because in Parashat Kisisa it suggests that Hashem will only be Misnachem ala Ra'ah for his Am. That was Moshe's argument. That's how Moshe convinced Hashem to be Nichem ala Ra'ah. And here in Sefer Yonah, it's Hashem does the same thing for a people who are not Amoy. Okay. Furthermore, in another conflict, in the aftermath of the Ego, Moshe Rabbeinu asks in that parak where he wants to know the ways of Hashem, and the Yud Gimel Midas Harachamim are revealed to him, which are also quoted in Sefer Yonah in Parak Daled, where Yonah says, "I know that Hashem is Kilchanun V'Racham V'Chapayim V'Rav Chesed V'Nicham Al Hara'ah." And in that same passage, in that same narrative, Moshe Rabbeinu asks, "V'neflinu aniva amcho mikol ha'amim asher al pnei ha'adamah." Again, the idea that aniva amecha, that Am Yisrael is the Am of Hashem, and because of that, which obviously means that other nations are not, and because of that, we will be neflinu, we will be wondrous and unique. And the uniqueness of Am Yisrael is, according to Chazal, that Moshe Rabbeinu asked that the Shekhinah should not be shayra on other nations. Prophecy should only be prevalent in Israel. And so what we pointed out is that this book, where a Navi has a message to the nations to bring them back to tshuva, something which is typically the way things are done with Klal Yisrael, that Navim are sent to them to bring them back to tshuva, that itself is undermining the uniqueness of Klal Yisrael that Moshe Rabbeinu negotiated after the Egel. He negotiated this kind of uniqueness that we are Amcha, we are Am Hashem, that he took out of Mitzrayim, separated us from the other Amim, and we are therefore his Am, and therefore we have a unique relationship with him, which is the relationship that's mediated by the Nevi'im, and other nations do not have this. And therefore, the whole mission of Yonah, to go to Nineveh with a message, is in conflict or in tension with the negotiated relationship between Am Yisrael and Hashem that is described after the Egel. Okay, that, and among other points, we explored that, but that's the point that's relevant for we're going to discuss today. And we said furthermore that Yonah's escape to Tarshish is essentially him. It's essentially showing that this mission is fundamentally fraught, or maybe even flawed, for a Navi to be sent to Nineveh, because Nevi'im are for the Am Hashem, and the Dvar Hashem is supposed to be Hashem Keracham Mechanun, Erechapayim Erechesed Emes, and Nichom for his nation. We are the ones who have the Dvar Hashem and that relationship. The other nations are not supposed to have that. And therefore, this message of Kum Lech al Nineveh is, in the fact that it's in conflict with the Torah, is at least we can say that goes along with the fact that Yonah didn't want to do it. Soon we'll explain that. That's what we're going to get to a little bit more about what exactly is the resolution of this conflict. And last week we spoke about Yonah in light of the Mabul. That was 2 weeks ago. That we don't have to get back to now. Right, okay, we could skip that whole thing. Fine. I want to point out another thing, remind you that, as we said tonight, Yonah quoted some of the Yud Gimel Midas, but only the positive ones. He quoted Chanun Rachamech by Rav Chesed v'nicham halara'ah. He even switched out emes and replaced it with nicham halara'ah because that was his argument to God that that's not quite emes. And nonetheless, he's called Yonah ben Amitai. So there's a debate here about emes. I seem to recall some Ramban about this. Right. In Shlach, Moshe argued, Hashem Erech Hapayim V'Rav Chesed Nosi Avim V'Pesha. He left out MS2 over there. I think the Ramban might comment on that. Okay. Either way, Yonah mentions some of the Yud Gimel Midas and applies the Yud Gimel Midas to the other nations. Which again, going back to Kisisa, the Yud Gimel Midas are the Darchei Hashem that it was revealed to Moshe, who argued that he has to know the Yud Gimel Midas of Hashem because Amecho Hagoy Hazeh. In other words, as the Rambam says in the Merdevuchim Chelik Aleph Perek Nun Daled, since Moshe Rabbeinu is the king, the leader, the ruler of a nation that is not considered his nation, but rather is considered Hashem's nation, therefore he must be privy to Hashem's political theory, which is the 13 attributes. So here, there's another Am, not Hashem's people. They have their own king, the king of Nineveh, who presumably stands in the way of them being Hashem's people, because instead Hashem is not their king. And yet, nonetheless, they are being treated, they are being ruled by Hashem, based on Hashem's rules of the Yud Gimel Midas. That's furthermore a conflict with Kisisa. They're very quoting the Yud Gimel Midas in the context of a foreign nation. And as we said in the first year, I think this was, there's a sequel to the story of Nineveh, which is 2 books after Yonah in the Trei Asar, and that's the Sefer of Nahum. And Sefer of Nahum is the Sefer of Doom on Nineveh. And there Nahum begins with also borrowing from the Yud Gimel Midas, but there he turns it to great disaster and suffering and troubles. He's saying Hashem Erech Hapayim Gadol Koyach Nake Lo Yinak Hashem Besufo B'Sara Darkoi, and Hashem is killed Kanei V'Noikim Noikim U'Bal Chema, etc. for his enemies. So what as we discussed is that Yonah talks about the first half of the Nineveh narrative is when they experienced the positive or the kind, pleasant, maybe we should say, midas of Hashem. The second half of the Yonah narrative, where according to Chazal, 40 years later they backslid and went back to their old terrible ways, and therefore were ultimately destroyed. Just instead of being 40 days, it turned into 40 years. And then the second half of the Yud Gimel Midas, we can call it, or at least the Midas Hadin element of the Yud Gimel Midas, were then applied to them, and they were destroyed. And furthermore, in this we credit someone at the Shir who pointed out, I would say his name, but I'm not sure he wants me to, that at the end of Micha, which is in the middle between Yonah and Nahum, at the end of Micha, we have the psukim that correspond to the Yud Gimel Midas. Mi kel kamecha nois avan v'apesha, and that lines up 1 to 1. They line up all 13 there, and there it says l'she'eris nachalosai. So the she'eris nachalosai is to Yisrael. So when the Yud Gimel Midas are applied to the non-Am Hashem, which itself is a novelty, an innovation that conflicts with Kisisa, which we'll talk about soon, they split into 2. They either have it very good or they have it very bad. The she'eris nachlosai, the remnant that survives, and we'll talk about that survival. I hope I remember to get back to that, what that surviving is. The surviving remnant of Hashem's nachala experiences all of the Yud Gimel Midas, all of the 13 Midas together. Okay? So that's the summary of, I don't think I added anything now, just summarize what we discussed. Now I want to resolve the problem of, okay, so how do we have this book that undercuts what it says in the Torah? That a Navi is not sent to the other nations, and that Hashem has a way of changing his mind and not punishing his own Am, implying that it doesn't apply to another Am, and here we see it apply to another Am. So I want to explain the following. I think it's very simple. That on the one hand, we, the nation of Israel, can be the Am Hashem. And in that model, where we are Hashem's Am, in that model, the way Hashem acts towards Am Yisrael is going to be fundamentally different from the way he acts to the other Amim. But in order for us to be Hashem's Am and achieve that unique kind of relationship where he treats us differently than he treats the other Amim, we have to be separate from the other Amim. We have to be in Eretz Yisrael. But since there's going to be exile and Am Yisrael is going to mix into and among the other Amim, therefore it's necessary, there has to be an approach, there has to be a method whereby all the Amim can be treated as Am Hashem. Okay, so let me just state the theory again clearly, and then we'll talk about the sources for this. There's this Amai relationship that Moshe secures for Am Yisrael. That Am Yisrael, uniquely among all the other nations, will be treated as the Am Hashem, and Am Yisrael alone will be treated as Am Hashem. Okay, so that means Hashem's Hanhaga in the world will be fulfilled through his hashgacha, through his relationship with Am Yisrael, not with the other Amim, no problem. Now, the problem, it does become a problem when the Am Yisrael mixes among the other Amim, and such that they don't have a unique identity. They have an identity that is influenced by the identity of the other Amim. So in that case, unless Hashem's hashgacha is going to include the other Amim, there's not going to be a way for him to be mashgiach uniquely on Am Yisrael, right? That's a very simple problem. So therefore, yes, the Torah says a method of Hashem's relationship with Am Yisrael, which is Amecha, we are his nation and others are not Amoi, given the reality that there's going to be an exile and going to be a mixing among Am Yisrael and Amim, therefore something has to change. And the roots of this essentially are there right in Parshas Yisro, Parshas Kisisa, where Moshe says to Hashem, Lama Hashem yechere apcha ba'amecha asher hoitzeso me'eretz Mitzrayim, which means to say that the taking them out of that land and making them into a separate people, given that Hashem is the one who made them a separate people, separate from Mitzrayim, that means that Hashem is treating them as different from Mitzrayim, which further means then that it's the moment they go back to exile, here represented by Mitzrayim, but if they go back to exile, then they no longer have that status of being uniquely the Am Hashem. So this negotiation that Moshe had with Hashem, whereby he attained this status, this unique status of Amai for Yisrael, Yisrael alone among all the nations, it's considered Am Hashem, that's predicated on the fact that Am Yisrael was separate from the other nations. And it's based on the fact that Hashem took them out of Mitzrayim and made them into something different from everyone else. But the moment that they go back to Golus, there's a need to figure out how is the ideal of a nation, a people being Am Hashem going to be achieved, given that they are mixed in with the other nations. The answer is going to be that it has to be achieved, it somehow has to be modified, or modified is the wrong word, but it has to be executed in a way that can incorporate the people among whom the Am Yisrael is residing and by whom they're being influenced. This is the theory, and so then basically Yonah then is a sefer of Golus. Yonah, actually it's interesting, it says in the Teichacha, and I'm pretty sure it's a medrash that says that this is a good thing, because like it says, and therefore it came back. So the Yonah is Klal Yisrael that is sent off from Eretz Yisrael, but is not comfortable in exile, and therefore will eventually return to Eretz Yisrael. So, right, so Yonah the Navi represents Klal Yisrael that goes off flies off to the among the nations. Actually, this brings you also to Masechtas Kinim. You look at my piece on Masechtas Kinim in Mishnas Yaakov. The birds flying around is taken as the symbol for Klal Yisrael going into exile and learning to speak the 70 languages, being influenced from the other nations, etc. Okay, what am I saying that? Oh, right, because basically sending Yonah to a foreign nation is symbolic of the fact that Klal Yisrael, who's Hashem's Yonah, is going to mix in with the other nations. And therefore, Hashem's way of relating to Klal Yisrael is going to have to then incorporate the other nations, and that's what this story is about. How can it incorporate the other nations? So I want to bring you some sources for this, and then we'll basically we're going to go through many other psukim that will, number one, serve as sources for this idea, but also give it some more clarity. Let's start from Sefer Tzefanya, another one of the Trei Asar. In the end of Perek Beis of Tzefanya talks about a nevuah against Nineveh. This is Perek Beis Pasuk Yud Gimel. Nineveh will be desolate. Okay. And Perek Gimel begins with a nevuah directed to the Ir HaYonah. So notice right there we have a nevuah to Nineveh, and then we have a nevuah directed to an Ir HaYonah, which means Yerushalayim, according to Mefarshim, and according to Medi, the Yonah is the dove, and Klal Yisrael is Nimshlo to a Yonah. There's other ways to read it, but either way, we have Nineveh and a Yonah there. And this Ir HaYonah, meaning other ways to read why it's called Yonah, but it's referring to Yisrael or Yerushalayim. This Ir HaYonah doesn't listen to the voice and take Musar. Okay, interesting. Nineveh did originally, but they don't. Okay, and now look at Pasuk Vav. We're in Perek Gimel Tzefanya Pasuk Vav. It says, "Hichrati goyim neshamu pinoisam." Terrible things happen to the nations. Pasuk Zayin, Amarti tikchi musar. It was also that you should take a musar, but it doesn't work. And then it continues. We'll get back soon. I'm going to bring that back to Sefer Yonah. Okay, but first let's just see that the other nations that are suffering in order that Yisrael takes musar from it, the other nations eventually have a role to play further in the story, which is in Pasuk Ches. It says, "Mishpati le'asoif goyim lekovtzi mamlachos." All the nations will gather against Yisrael in order that lishpach alehem zami kol charenapi. So they're going to gather against Israel. This famous idea from Gog and Magog, Zechariah, and Yechezkel, Micha also, I think, right? Kumi v'doishi. Okay, they're going to gather there. They're going to be nesaf. All the goyim are going to be nesfu Yerushalayim al Melchama, and Hashem is going to pour His wrath on them. And then then that's going to teach all the nations to serve Hashem. So there's three moves over here about Yisrael and Amim. Actually, four. We'll get to the fourth one soon. Number one, in order that Yisrael should take Musar. So they suffer, the Yisrael is supposed to take Musar from them. They're going to gather against Yerushalayim in order that Hashem pours His wrath on them. And then they're all going to call the Shem Hashem. And then it ends, that the book of Tzefanya ends with Beis Ahi Avi Eschem, Beis Kabetzi Eschem, that Hashem is going to gather all of His people that are dispersed among the nations, and they're going to become Hashem l'sehila b'chola meharetz b'shuv yishvit seichel elechem. Okay, so the nations suffer so that Yisrael should take Musar. The nations will gather to Yerushalayim, and Hashem will pour His wrath on them. The nations then will serve Hashem, and Bnei Yisrael will come back from all the nations who now know Yisrael, and therefore Hashem is going to be, Yisrael is going to be Hashem l'sehila b'chola meharetz. Okay, so now what does this have to do with the Sefer Yonah? So, well, first of all, so as I said, it's the Ir HaYonah, and the whole theme of Yonah is Yisrael v'Amim. Yisrael v'Amim, Yonah goes into this boat, And as the pasuk says there, that everyone is kairei b'shem Vayiz'aku ish el Elohav, and he told him kum kro el Elohecha. So what Sefania says is that eventually l'koy chulam b'shem Hashem, they're all going to be kari b'shem Hashem. They're not going to be kari ish b'shem Elohav. And here it says also that the purpose of the goyim suffering is tikhi musar, like Yonah, who's in a boat with all the people, and of course Chazal say 70 people from the 70 nations, and terrible things are happening to the Aniyah, and everyone doesn't know why, and really it's all for him. He's the one that it's directed. He's supposed to learn from it. He's supposed to be Yareh, as it says in Tzfanya, Tir'i Tikri Musa, and he said, and Yareh, meaning this is happening because of me. And there in Tzfanya it says, Epoich ala amim, so I want to say that's the Nineveh Nepeches. Nineveh is supposed to be transformed into a nation that is Kari B'Shem Hashem. Okay? So in other words, he's on his boat with these people that are Kari B'Shem Elokov, and eventually they all convert and they recognize Hashem, and this is a foreshadowing because of the fact that Nineveh is Nepeches, supposed to be Epech Ela'amim, Safavur, L'Koi Kul B'Shem Hashem. Okay? Fine. And another thing that it says in Tzefanya, this is in Perek Gimel Pasuk Tes Vav. It says Hashem removes your enemies. Melech Yisrael Hashem b'kirbech. Hashem, who is the king of Yisrael, is in your midst. So the fact that Hashem is king of Yisrael, as we said, that's not something to be taken for granted, because that means that we are Amai. Why does it mean that we are Amai? Because why would someone not be the Am Hashem? Because they're ruled by a different king. But if Hashem is our king, is in our midst, that means that our political leaders know the Darchei Hashem, and therefore we are the Am Hashem. And that's the theme that Sefer Yonah is dealing with. Who is the Am Hashem? What do we do with the fact that Nineveh has their own melech? And as we're saying now, what do we do with the fact that that city, that foreign country, foreign nation that has its own melech, is going to mix together with Bnei Yisrael because they're going to go in their midst. So like we said, that's what Tzfanya is doing. What do we do with the relationship of Yisrael v'Amim? And the answer is, it's complicated. Firstly, Yisrael is going to learn from their suffering. But that's not going to work, it says in Tzfanya. And so instead, there's going to be this gathering where the nations are going to stand up against Yisrael. And then they're going to suffer for that. But they're going to learn from that to serve Hashem. And then Yisrael is going to come back to Eretz Yisrael. And amazing. Okay, so there is an eventual coming together of all the Amim, Safar, Bur, Liquid, Kul, Mashem, Hashem. So that means, just put it that way, just right there. Yes, it says in Parashat Kisisa that we are the Am Hashem and another nation is not, implying that another nation is not. Then he says, that's only until such time that they're all Kari B'Shem Hashem, right? That's what it says in Sefer Yeshaya. That there's no difference between a ben hanecha, bal yoyim ben hanecha. So eventually, havdeli avdilani. Eventually, it'll all be the same. Eventually, there will be nevuah on Gerim. By the way, this is a big principle I said within my sefer, that even though the Kuzi says that the shechita is actually on Gerim, that's only true in the current model. I don't know where we stand, but in the future, where it says Al Yoma Ben Hanecha Havdil Avdilani, so everyone's going to be the same. That means everyone's going to be Am Hashem. Okay, how's that the case? Why is that the case? Look at my sefer. Okay, now I want to go to another source for this, which is Yeshaya Perek Samach. By the way, look at my sefer. That means there's two pieces that are very relevant in Mishnas Yaakov, based Tefillah L'chol Amim and Psach Elakinim, are both relevant to this discussion. Yeshaya Perek Samach, which we discussed in, I think, the first year, because there it talks about the Yoinim returning to the coops, and it talks about the boats of Tarshish. and also we spoke about this in the last year, then Yeshaya Perek Samach Vav, it talks about the goyim that are going to attack Yerushalayim, and then some of them will be like the same thing it says in Tzefania. Some of them will survive in order to go to Tarshish, which are the places that haven't heard Kavoidi, Loishamwe should be Leros Kavoidi, and then they're going to bring the covet there. So Tarshish is a place that's completely mufka. It's already to have to take a sea voyage to get there. So as we discussed last year, there's Nineveh, and that's not Yisrael, but it's contiguous. It's not so far to get to Tarshish. That's already second order distance from Yisrael. You have to take a boat to get there. And that's what it says in Yeshaya Perek Samach Vav. And then there's two stages over here, which is the nations around Yisrael are going to attack Yisrael, and therefore through that learn the greatness of Hashem, and they're going to bring that message even to Tarshish, the place of Leiros Kavoidi. By the way, keep that in mind, Leiros Kavoidi, because now going back to Yeshaya Perek Samach, where it also talks about the boats of Tarshish. And by the way, in Yeshaya Perek Samach and in Yeshaya Perek Samach Vav, it talks about bringing back Bnei Yisrael who are in the far-flung countries, and that's like we have in Tzefania 2, that theme. That there's a theme, there's a problem of Golus, there's a problem of Yisrael being exiled in Alim, and how are they going to be brought back? Okay. And now I want to take you through Yeshaya Perek Samach. You know what? I'm not going to take you through the whole thing now. I want to just, you know what? Let's say one point from Yeshaya Perek Samach, and then we'll go through all a lot of the psukim there. But Yeshaya Perek Samach is about, it parallels to this parsha, and there it says in Samach, Perek Samach, pasuk Yud Aleph, Ufittechu sh'arayich tomid yoimom v'layda lo yisageru. Your gates will be opened constantly to bring to you chel goyim u'malchehem nehugim. Okay, that's in Yeshaya Perek Samach pasuk Yud Aleph, that the gates of Yerushalayim will be open constantly to bring the might, the wealth, and the kings let in. And I want you to look at this and contrast this with with Nahum, the Nevuah on the downfall of Nineveh, and in Nahum Perek Gimel. In Nahum Perek Gimel pasuk Yud Gimel, it says Patoyach niftechu sha'arei artzeich. The gates of your land are open. So like we had in Yeshaya Perek Samach pasuk Yud Aleph, Ufitchu sha'arei, to bring in the wealth. In Nahum, the gates are opened to make it vulnerable to attack. Okay, so there's Nineveh and there's Yerushalayim. In other words, so there's a story of Nineveh. So let me explain what I'm saying. There's a story of Nineveh, which is the same story as the story of the future of Yerushalayim. The Hainu, it's a story about what to make of the fact that there's a mixing between Yisrael and Amim. And Nineveh, that has to be dealt with. So one way to deal with that is to send a Navi to the Nineveh and see what happens. And we'll get to this, how that works. Another way to deal with that, and that sort of works because Nineveh doesn't get overturned, but then eventually it do get overturned. That's what happens in Nahum. So then the long-term story of the solution to this problem of how do we deal with the mix of Yisrael and Amim, that's described in Yeshaya Perek Samach, that's described in Tzefania Perek Gimel, and that gets a little more complicated. That's not just that the Navi is going to be sent to them and they'll literally be treated like Yisrael. They're going to have to learn the hard way, which is by ganging up on Yisrael and experiencing Hashem's wrath, and then recognizing that they should serve Hashem, etc., etc., etc. Okay? So, what do I want to do over here? Oh yes, just another thing is that it ends, Sefer Nahum, as we mentioned this the first time, that Sefer Nahum, Perek Gimel, Pasuk Yud Ches, talks to the king of Ashur and calls him Amcha. And that's the whole point. The downfall of Nineveh happens when the king of Nineveh is recognized as being the real king, and they're his Am, not Hashem's Am, unlike what's suggested in Sefer Yonah. Okay. We pointed this out, I think, that in Yeshaya Perek Yud Tes, there's a shocking pasuk. The last pasuk in Perek Yud Tes in Yeshaya is Baruch Ami Mitzrayim Uma'aseh Yodai Ashur V'Nachalosi Yisrael. So Mitzrayim is the Am Hashem. Wow. and his Maaseh Yodai is Ashur, and his Nachlos is Yisrael. So I just want to line this up for a moment. Nachlos Yisrael is like the pasuk in Micha, She'eres Nachalosoi, which is, as we said, it's corresponding to Yisrael. Titan Emes LiYaakov Chesed Avraham. Maaseh Yodai Ashur perhaps is related to the pasuk of Vayarlekim es Maasehem Kishavim Dachim Arav Vayinachem Alekim Al Rasha Diva La Asoy Islam Eloi Osa. So they have to do with the Asiyah. Okay. Now, why is Mitzrayim? Here Mitzrayim is called Ami. This takes us back, and for this you have to go back to the Shurim in the beginning of Miketz, to the conversation of Yosef and Pare, where there's this Atati al Beis al Picha Yichshak Ami, and corresponding to the Mizmor of Lu Ami Shemei Ali, and there's a debate about how do we treat Bnei Yisrael vis-a-vis the Am of Pare. Are they one Am, or is Am Yisrael the Am Hashem, and therefore distinct from the people of Mitzrayim who are the Am of Pare? And why is there a debate about that? Because Yosef considers himself to be, identifies himself and his people, maybe, with Pare's people. And that's because, as we're saying, it's very nice to talk about Am Yisrael as being a distinct Am and they're Am Hashem, but once they mix in with another nation, then they could lose that identity of being Am Hashem. Or the nation in which they mix has to achieve that identity. So therefore, Baruch Ami Mitzrayim, Ayin Sham in the Shurim, Baruch Ami Mitzrayim, Perek Yutes in Yeshaya is corresponds to this possibility that happens in the beginning of Miketz, that Yosef may embrace Mitzrayim and may, instead of descending to their level, maybe will bring them to the level of, or raise them to the level of being considered the nation of Hashem as he is. So I'm bringing this to show you that it has to do with exile. Okay? And as we said, the argument of we're being Am Hashem is, as it says in Parshas Kisisa, so if we go back to exile, then we have to deal with, we have to figure out a way to bring the virtue of Yisrael to the nations, because they're influencing Am Yisrael. So there's no Am Yisrael that's distinct from anyone. This is a theme that, like I said, my Swam talk about it, I have many shurim about this. Okay, so now I want to explain, going back to the questions that we started with. Okay, so the Navi is being sent to them because this is like an experiment. Let's see what happens now that we have to bring, we have to mix with the other nations. So maybe we have to bring them Nevuah. We can't be separate from them. It's a good theory. And maybe we should apply maybe the king of Nineveh should subject himself to the 13 principles, 13 attributes, such as Moshe did. So what happens is the 13 attributes are indeed brought to the people of Nineveh. However, they're brought up in a very interesting way. As we said, the first half here, they're broken up. The second half in Nachum, where they're destroyed. And in the middle, we have the 13 attributes, L'She'eres Nachlos. I want to explain what that means. That, okay, we're going to talk to the people of Nineveh, to the other nations. Nineveh stands for the other nations. We're going to talk to them in the language of Hashem, Karacham, Machanu, but they can't do it in the same way of Yisrael does. They're not Yisrael, they have a different experience. Here's what they can do. They can have Hashem, Karacham, Machanu. They can have the good midas, and Nichem Al, everything goes swimmingly. And they could also have the Hashem Kelkanav and Noikim Bachim, like it says in Nachum. But what they cannot have is the blend that the only ones that experience are Yisrael. In other words, it means like this. Like we said, what are we doing with the fact that Yisrael mixes the nations? So should we just bring a Navi to them? No, it doesn't work. Why? Because they could only be Makabal. Either they could accept Hashem is good and kind, and then they could do tshuva. But they can't accept that Hashem, the negative aspects of Hashem, because once they face those, they just backslide. And this is obviously something to think about very deeply. Why is this the case? What's this all about? It's very, very deep questions. We're scratching the surface here. Okay? So instead, they have to gather to Yerushalayim and do war and learn the hard way about Hashem and Yeshaya and Zephaniah. Okay? And that's going back to, I wanted to get back to this point, Micha, where it says the 13 attributes for Yisrael. There it says, L'She'eres Nachlosei, for the remnant. Because the story of Yonah and the story of Nachum is what to do with the fact that Yisrael is Mis'arev Ben Hagoyim. And it's trying to give the Yud Gil Midas to the nations, and it says, okay, Yonah gives them one part, and Sefer Yonah, that is, the Navi's obviously not happy with that because it's not the full story. In fact, the full story needs Yitnacham, where he gives them the second part, and they get completely, utterly destroyed. So then, in that light, or from that perspective, Yonah's escape, Vayakom Yonah Livreich Tarshisha, is essentially like going into exile. In other words, the word of Hashem to Yonah saying, hey, we have to talk to the king of Nineveh, is basically foreshadowing that Israel goes into exile and is not lifnei Hashem. So Yonah just enacts that and picks up and runs away. So it's perfect. Okay. Now I want to talk about, go back to Yeshaya Perek Samach, and I want to talk about this word, Yonah went livroach. He went to be bayreach. I noticed something interesting. I think it's interesting because these allusions will bear it out, which is that in the tefillah of Yonah in Perek Beis, we have that Beis Reish Ches Barach in a different sense. In Perek Beis Pasuk Zayin, he says Haaretz biricheha ba'adi. The bolts, the chain, the locks of the aretz are locking me in. But we have that word barach. Okay, notice that. And now notice that we'll see. I think how there's a word play on this Yonah being bayreach, which now you see that bayreach is very significant because he's bayreach means, the fact that he's bayreach means that he is enacting essentially golus, right? We have a problem. The Jewish people have a problem, which is that we are not lifnei Hashem. We're not in Eretz Yisrael. And since we're not lifnei Hashem, so you would think that perhaps we should bring the Dvar Hashem to Nineveh. But that can't be done. Can't be done properly, which is exactly what this story is showing us. So therefore, that confirms that we're indeed not lifnei Hashem, and we have a problem encapsulated in that barach. So that's why I keep on saying that I don't make too much of a big deal about Yonah running away. I think it's actually very appropriate. In other words, Mefarshim will talk about how did Yonah run away, what's going on, what is he thinking. But I think the running away is part of the nevuah. It's exactly what has to happen. It's a symbol. And now we're saying it's not just a symbol of the fact that this nevuah is impossible, but it's also a symbol of the state of the Yonah, Klal Yisrael, who is essentially, when they go to Galus, is inevitably running away from Hashem because they can't bring the Dvar Hashem into Galus, because try to bring it to Nineveh, and it doesn't quite work. Instead, you have to go through this difficult, arduous process described in Yeshaya Perek Samach and Tzefania Perek Gimel and other places. Now I want to go back to Yeshaya Perek Samach, and I want to darshan this psukim there, show you a few things to just darshan the correspondence. Kumi oiri kivoirech. So kumi is like kum lechel Nineveh. And Chavoid Hashem, remember it says in Yeshaya Perek Samach Vav that Tarshish is the place that Leiro was Kvoidi. They don't now we have Kvod Hashem, but they're going to eventually attain it. And this, by the way, is picked up in the Pirkei de Belezer, where it says that Yonah said, "I'm going to go to the sea to run away from Hashem," because it doesn't say Kvoidoi of Hashem on the sea. It says Kvoidoi of Haaretz Ir Mechvoidoi, and it says something about the Shemayim, Sapim Kvod, I guess. But it never says in Tanakh the word covered on the Yam. That's how the Radal, I think, explains it. And Yonah said, I'm going to go away to Yam. But the point is that Tarshish is the place that's lacking Hashem's covered. Okay? And here in Yeshaya Perek Samach, where it's saying, no, eventually the Kvod Hashem, darkness isn't covered the arts, but Kvod Hashem is going to shine to you. But as we said also, that doesn't exclude, we said this last time, it doesn't exclude the nations, because next pasuk immediately says, V'holchu goyim lo yirech. So they're going to be covered in darkness. The covered Hashem is going to be shining on you, but they're going to pick up on that. And even Tarshish, which is a place, so Leiros Kvod is eventually going to see the covered, because the word is going to get even to faraway places. Okay, and there it talks about everyone coming back. And look at Pasuk K, again, the theme of all the children coming back from Galus, same theme we have in the Samach Vav and in Tzefania Perek Gimel, Beis Kabetz Yes. And Pasuk K, it says, you're going to see V'rochav levavech. Your heart is going to become rochav, wide. So remember that the gates are going to be open for the chel, for the might, right, and for the chel goyim. And here it says that your heart is going to be rochav, and the chel goyim is going to be nepach. The hamoyim is going to be nepach. So I want to say like this: I want to say like this. I want to say that this rochav is corresponding to barach, levroyach. In other words, So the trauma of Golos is captured by this word Levrayach. We're running away from Hashem. But really what's supposed to happen is that our hearts are supposed to become wider. For Rochav Levavech. And how's that going to happen? So that's Barach, Rochav instead of Barach. And how's that going to happen? Ki Yehofech Alayich Hamoin Yom. All the wealth of the Yam is going to be Nepach. So that's Oida Barimim V'Niveh Nepeches is really foreshadowing. The real solution to Nineveh is Az Epoich Ala'am Sof Evura, or Yehofech Alayich Hamoin Yom, that all the wealth will come back to Shalayim, as it says there in Perek Samach, famous Psukim Tachas and Nachash Zav Yitzav, all the wealth is going to come back. Okay, and there also it says, the other pasuk that we mentioned earlier, so Fitchu Sharayich Tabed Yom Avalai Lo Yisageru. That's in Perek Samach, pasuk Yud Aleph, and pasuk Yud Beis says, Ki Hagoyim Amlocha Shelo Yavduch Yovid V'Hagoyim Chorev Yecharevu. Those who don't serve you, Chorev Yecharevu. So I want to say that's another play on Bayreach. So the Golos was captured by Yonah is Bayreach is going to lead to Arochav Levavech, and the ones who don't serve Yisrael and don't learn, the Goyim who don't learn from Yisrael, the Bericha, are going to be Chorev Yecharevu. Okay, now here's how I'm going to complete the Shtikot Torah. Here it says in Yeshaya Perek Samach pasuk Yudalef Ufitchu Sharayich Tamid, which before we connected to Nachum Perek Gimel, where it says about the destruction of Nineveh. It says Pasach Niftechu Sha'arei Artzech. Okay, the gates of your Aretz, and there the pasuk ends Ochla Eish Berichayich. And in Yonah it said Ha'aretz Bericheha Ba'adi. So that's my fourth allusion of this Barach, right? He's Bayreach, but so that encapsulates the idea of Golos. Really, Golos is a place of Berichim, could be lock you in. You have to watch out from that. And for the Goyim who don't serve Yisrael, it's going to lead to Chorov Yecharavu. And when that happens, the ones who do contribute to the success of Yisrael are going to lead to a Rochav Livovech. And this is contrasting then, so we see the contrast between Yerushalayim, the Ir HaYoinah, and Nineveh, which happens in Yeshaya Perek Samach to Nachum Perek Gimel, and there more explicitly in Tzefanya Perek Gimel. And we will leave it at that, and I wish everyone a Gemar Chasima Tova.